On August 6, the atomic bomb was used in war for the first time on the city of Hiroshima. 3 days later, it was used again on the Japanese city of Nagasaki. This, combined with Russia joining the war against the Japanese, was one of the major reasons that they surrendered for the Second World War. America entered the war after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. This caused America to have a sort of constant battle with Japan during the events of World War II. Although they did help on the war in Europe, America mostly focused on the Pacific Ocean. This peeled Japan away from the war in Europe, and eventually both major countries were mostly focusing on each other. After a while, both countries were getting a little tired of the war. Both were running out of manpower and supplies, but Japan refused to surrender. They were prepared to send everything they had in America to guarantee the victory of the Pacific War. The Japanese had a code of honor that they refused to break. America knew that they would lose about 500,000 men in an invasion of Japan, so they had to think of a more tactical way to invade them. And what's more tactical than blowing 2 entire cities up? On the day of the bombing of Hiroshima, children had left or were about to leave for school. Teenage schoolgirls were out picking up trash and debris from the previous fire raids that were carried out in the city. The bomb exploded on I-15, so most adults were commuting to work. This is one of the main reasons there were so many casualties. Believe it or not, simple buildings that were little more than a mile away actually protected the people inside from the blast. This protection was increased in buildings with light paint because the light and heat bounced off of it, which actually saved lives in some cases. Of course, that depended on whether the building had started to fall apart and other factors relating to the survival of the victim. Also, bombs nowadays are hundreds of times stronger and could easily wipe multiple miles off the map. In Hiroshima, around 140,000 people died from the blast and sickness related to the radiation poisoning. On the other hand, in Nagasaki, only around 80,000 people died. This is because the bomb fell into a small valley, which protected the city above more than in Hiroshima, where it landed on flat land. Also, in general, Nagasaki was just hillier than Hiroshima, which helped reduce the blast. Because of the open flat land that Hiroshima was built on, immense fires were forming, especially around 1 mile from the blast site. This created a phenomenon known as firestorms, which is when a flame is so powerful that it creates its own wind system. In this graph, you can see the population of Hiroshima before the bomb exploded versus after the bomb exploded. This includes people who died of radiation poisoning. Only around 100,000 people died in the initial explosion. In this graph, you can see the population of Nagasaki before versus after the bomb. This graph also includes the people who died of radiation sickness. As you can see, the graph shows significantly less deaths than Hiroshima. Only around 80,000 people died in the blast itself. After the explosion, people who didn't die in the blast had to deal with the sickness. In many ways, the people who died in the initial blast had the easy way out. They didn't know whether they would die and experience little to no pain. That's because the bomb was so powerful that it basically disintegrated anyone who was close enough. People who were about 1.5 miles to 5 miles had the worst experience. They had to make it out of the city collapsing on top of them, while also dealing with the radiation poisoning they most likely picked up from the explosion. Luckily, there were a few safe spots inside of Hiroshima and Nagasaki where surviving doctors had set up to take care of people. Of course, they did not know the proper way to cure it and basically only took care of them as they died a slow and painful death. Symptoms of radiation poisoning were terribly awful. As the infected waited for the doctors to figure out how to help them, they experienced swelling of the mouth and throat, diarrhea, fever, and emaciation. Lots of people died around 10 to 31 days after being infected with radiation sickness. A victim of Little Boy wrote about his horrific experience in one of these shelters in his diary, which was later published in 1955. He wrote about how the space was so cramped that people were lying packed together like sardines, some people even on top of each other. The conditions were so terrible that people just went to the bathroom on the floor and on top of each other without getting up, which made the entire shelter very unsanitary. A few days after the bombing exploded, American soldiers were sent to check out the remains of the cities. What they found was horrifying, as you can see in these pictures. As you can see, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were both destroyed. The Japanese were obviously very angry with the US and did not want them coming in their country to look at all the damage that had occurred, so they had to be sent in secret. Stanley Troutman was a photographer who documented the destruction of the bomb. He traveled to Hiroshima a few days after the bomb exploded and snapped a few of these pictures. The Enola Gay, the famous plane that dropped the bomb onto Hiroshima, had a crew of about 12 people. On the way home after the mission, it was completely silent, Sergeant Joseph Staborik recalls. All he remembers hearing on the way home is co-pilot Robert Lewis's famous line, "My God, what have we done?" Most of the crew members didn't know about the power and intensity of the nuclear bomb. They were given very little information because President Truman was not sure how people would react. He told nothing about it to the public until after the act was done. After the bomb exploded, families started recovering and finding each other. They still lived in Hiroshima and built shacks out of scrap to live in. They barely had any food or water, but hope guided them through each day. The first plant that grew in the wasteland that was Hiroshima was the red canna flower. People saw this and knew that there was a way to turn the wasteland back into a thriving city once more. My historical event is a little different when it comes to the theme triumph and tragedy, because my event represents both. Obviously, it was tragic about the hundreds of thousands of lives that were lost in the explosions, but America and the Allies most likely would have had to send many more troops to fight in the Pacific. This would have cost hundreds of thousands of lives more than the atomic bombs, which is why we decided to use them. The Allies triumphed over the Axis and won the war, but we also had to lose many innocent lives who had no say in whether or not they lived in Japan or if they wanted war. Because of this, people have been arguing about whether or not we should have nuked them ever since it first happened. I believe that it was necessary to winning the war while also causing as few casualties as possible. People are so distraught over the event because it was civilians, but what they fail to understand is that 5 times the amount would have been lost in American soldiers alone if we had decided to invade. Although I agree that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were terrible, I strongly believe that they were necessary to success in the Second World War. Although it wasn't the cleanest way out of the war, it is a constant reminder of what human beings are capable of and how dangerous our world is today.